Now we are on the American mainland. We are in the Midwest. Actually, we are in Kansas City, and with us we have Steve Kraske, old-time journalist, and he has worked for a generation or so for Kansas City Star, the big monopoly newspaper. And he's now has left Kansas City Star and has his own radio show. And on top of that, he's also teaching at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, so teaching future journalism students. So this guy, he knows what he's talking about. So Steve, welcome to this talk about a subject that I know you care a lot about, which is news deserts.
I do care a lot about that, and it's great to be with you, Ulrich. Happy to spend time with you.
Thank you. And if you take us back a long time, you have been a journalist since the mid '80s or something.
Yeah, the early '80s, but who's counting? Yeah,
we are, but still, but tell us how big was the newsroom at Kansas City Star when you started in the early mid '80s?
You know, it was an amazing place, Ulrich. So many people, so much energy, so much noise, and you had a fight to get a desk in the room to actually sit down and write a story sometimes. There were so many people in that room. In those days, we had two newspapers coming out of the same newsroom: the morning Kansas City Times, the afternoon Kansas City Star. The Kansas City Star was where Ernest Hemingway began his writing career, his journalistic career, right here in my backyard. It was an amazing place. And I'm here to tell you, before the newspaper moved out of that newsroom just a few years ago, it was a shell of itself. Just lots of empty desks. The energy was gone, not much noise. It felt more like an insurance company office than it did a newsroom.
How many buyouts have you experienced in your time at Kansas City Star?
You know, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, 17, 18 rounds of layoffs at the Kansas City Star. I took a voluntary buyout just a little over a year ago. It was very hard, to work in that kind of environment. It was depressing, so many people, your good friends, your colleagues heading out the door, 2 rounds of layoffs a year, typically, some larger than others. Trying to keep up morale was very difficult. As you might imagine, it just became a very difficult experience, and for a profession that everybody who was there was so committed to and loved so much. There are now Facebook pages for former Kansas City Star employees who get together and talk about things, what's going on today, what used to happen in the past. But it's been a very tough deal.
And of course, most of us will know the reason for this because the financial model of newsprint has been eroded. But this also started before the internet, right? The downturn.
Well, right. And the former chain, the Knight Ridder chain that proudly owned the Kansas City Star and more than about a couple dozen other newspapers around the country, San Jose, Miami, some of the bigger properties. Kansas City was the biggest property toward the end. Knight Ridder, the folks who ran that operation, sold the chain at precisely the right moment, Ulrich. Just as the business was beginning this long decline, Knight Ridder bailed out, McClatchy bought in, and the debt load that McClatchy acquired, picked up for buying all these newspapers, topped $1 billion. And it simply was impossible for the chain to turn a profit while adding staff or maintaining staff over those years. As readership declined, as circulation declined, the chain had no option but to let reporters go to maintain that profit margin that it felt that it had to have. And again, not an unusual story in this country, but a painful story.
And McClatchy Newspapers, that company that took it over from Knight Ridder, it went into bankruptcy, and including newspapers also like Miami Herald and also Kansas City Star. And so what's the situation now for that newsroom?
Well, the chain is just emerging from bankruptcy, but it's a very different set of newspapers than it used to be, Ulrich. The Kansas City Star has moved out of its historic newsroom at 17th and Grand, the newsroom where Ernest Hemingway cut his teeth. That building has been sold. It moved into a new building, a very sleek, modern building where the Star is printed and many other newspapers were printed. The news just broke last week that that building has now been sold, and it might even be turned into a new baseball park for the Kansas City Royals. That's a possibility down the road. And the newsroom, now reporters are simply looking for a new home. It's changed that much. It's only a fraction of what it used to be. Maybe 15 reporters on the city side, editorial board staff of 6 or 7. And it's a very different day in Kansas City. The community at large, very concerned about what this means going forward. How will people collect information, gather information? How will people stay abreast of the big developments in town? And as a result, you're seeing other news operations popping up, smaller operations, trying to carve out little niches, if you will, of the news gathering operation here in Kansas City and trying to make a run at it. But no operation would appear to be as dominant as the Star was back in its heyday, going back 15, 20 years ago.
But if you were cynical, you would just say, yeah, that's a pity, but if it can't stand, let it fall. And it's too bad for these journalists. They can start driving Uber taxis and the world will move on. And so let's talk about the public and the democratic conversation. I mean, honestly, do people really miss anything? Or don't they get their things from new platforms, new startups? Isn't things just moving in another direction? And that was the heydays, and that was fine. But that was the good old days. Now there'll be great days ahead. Should we care?
Well, I think the governing class of Kansas City, to use that expression, Ulrich, I think they miss the newspaper. An older, whiter demographic of people who have helped mold and shape Kansas City for generations. I think those folks, that class of people, is very much in mourning for the loss of this newspaper. Now, you're right, there's a new generation coming on board. People very used to getting their news online and running around at different sites for gathering their information. But the result is there's no, and you're seeing this all over the country, there's no one sort of set of agreed upon facts that everyone is working off of. People get a little story over here that no one else saw. They get a little information over here. Other leaders didn't see it. And there's just not as much of a common platform as there used to be. Our country at large is suffering from this. And I think certainly folks here in Kansas City are very much dealing with it too.
But when we look at the American election, and now we've been looking at that for month and month, and it's still not solved.
I'm sorry about
or
that.
Some people
I
claim
apologize to everybody for what they just went through here.
But what, to which degree is that polarization that we see in your country, which is so sad to watch? And if you care about America, you're really saddened about what you see here. How much has that polarization, that two different versions of truth all the time, how much has that to do with the drop of quality in journalism, the amount of journalism, the amount of what you talked about, this common denominator of fact-based journalism that pretty much a lot of people got their view of the world from?
I think it's a little tough to say. There's no doubt that the decline of newspapers, the decline in credibility of mainstream news outlets has been a factor in the polarization in this country that is so pronounced. There's no question about that. Is it all at the feet of the media and this decline? Probably not. We've seen the way campaign operatives run campaigns in this country, very much intending to split the American public into two camps. That's very much of a factor here too. But there's no question that that half the country, I'm speaking broadly here, the Republican Party of this country no longer trusts what it reads in the Kansas City Star or hears on the public radio station where I work. People have really flipped out of that, and they've all gone to the Fox News outlets, the cable, the very conservative radio outlets that are here in Kansas City to get their information. So you have people going into two different directions to get information here. And one result, if you look at a map of Missouri, if you look at a map of Kansas, you have a blue part in the Kansas City suburbs in Kansas, a little bit of blue in Lawrence, a little bit of blue in Topeka. The rest of the state is bright red. Same in Missouri, Ulrich, you know this very well. St. Louis and Kansas City are blue. The entire rest of the state is red. So you have two states into one, basically, and people getting their information from different places. It's not a recipe for solving this polarization that you're describing anytime soon.
So the constructive questions that we care about are the questions, okay, now we know that, now what and how? Meaning, when you look ahead on this, and with your knowledge base on democracy, you've been covering politics in your country and your state and your city for many years. Will this get worse, or will it get better?
You know, I would like to sit here today, Ulrich, and tell you that better days are coming, that we have a Democrat in the White House who has a different attitude towards the news media than his predecessor. I want to be optimistic and say we're going to figure this out. But I got to be honest with you, I don't see a path forward right now towards ending this level of polarization. There are too many groups in this country that depend on their financial survival on maintaining this split. The anti-abortion groups on the one hand, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party on the other. So many groups now have come to depend on this split continuing to maintain themselves going forward, that in the short run, for sure, I don't see a way forward here. The Kansas City Star situation is only getting worse. It's not getting better. I just described the sale of the printing plant to you, the newsroom literally looking for a home as we tape this conversation here today. Unbelievable. Public radio doing pretty well. Listenership stable, if not growing. The financial model seems pretty sound, but it seems to appeal more to the left side of the spectrum than the right, although a lot of Republicans do listen to us as well. And as I mentioned, we have these different startups coming into place now, trying to replace some aspects of the newspaper writ large and maybe making a little headway. You know, local TV has been something of a success story here. They make a lot of money off of political advertising, you know, tens of thousands of dollars every fall in this country, but you don't see them rising to the challenge and offering listeners and viewers a broader, more serious menu of issue stories that really take a hard look at at the big issues confronting the state. They do some good stuff, don't get me wrong, but they really haven't stepped up to the challenge in a way beyond very short 2-minute stories, minute 45 stories that they're very well known for. So I guess what I'm describing to you is we got a problem here. We got a really serious problem. And at the moment, I don't see an answer to it.
And still, you are teaching future journalists at your university. My God,
Yes.
what are you telling them? Why do you think they should become journalists? Well, if there's no hope, and where do you see their future?
A lot of my students, Ulrich, come to me not because they necessarily want to become journalists. They might have some interest in it. They want to learn more about it. And what I preach to them is learn how to write. Learn how to write concisely, learn how to write succinctly, and that will benefit you throughout the rest of your career. On the first day of my classes, I pass out a story that features Warren Buffett, the big billionaire from just up the river here in Omaha. And he talks very openly about the idea of if, as a student, you learn to communicate, speak clearly, and to write clearly, your lifetime earnings go up by 50%. I think that's pretty important. And I think that's a lesson worth teaching our students here. Now, some of them want to become journalists, and we've placed them at the Kansas City Star, at KCUR Public Radio, where I work, and at other outlets here in the Midwest, at TV stations. Some students still want to do it, but there's no question a lot of them come into the class a little skeptical. They think of journalism just through the prism of newspapers falling down, and they don't see other opportunities out there. and they want to learn more about information and how it's packaged and sold. They maybe want to learn a little bit how to write, but they don't necessarily want to become journalists going forward.
And finally, you have heard me over the years, because we know each other beforehand, talk about this idea of constructive journalism, focusing not only the problems, but also solution nuances, not only angling on the black or the white, and try to engage people in a dialogue. This kind of thinking about journalism, does that appeal to the next generation in the United States of journalists?
You know, Ulrich, I think what you're doing is so important. There needs to be voices talking about just the things you're talking about, not only in Europe, but across the globe. Your stuff goes everywhere these days. That's so important because someone has to keep that conversation going. There has to be a horizon that we're all aiming toward down the road to get this business back to where it needs to be. You know, you're going to be talking about news deserts here today. Let me tell you about something that's happening here in Kansas City right now. Right here in our metro, there's a whole quadrant of the metro that's getting almost literally no coverage at all. It's Wyandotte County. It's a poorer section of the Kansas City metro. The Kansas City Star has pulled out. TV stations don't go over there anymore to cover stories because people aren't as well off. They can't afford subscriptions. They don't watch local news all that much. And what I'm working on here at my university and with the University of Kansas is setting up a new bureau staffed with student journalists, overseen by professional journalists, to fill in the gap in this news desert right here in our backyards. And if you talk to the leaders of Wyandotte County, what they say to you is very quietly, we're worried about getting left out of the conversation here in Kansas City. No one's paying attention to us because nobody's covering us. When you're in a news desert, you begin to realize how important news coverage is. When it goes away, you've got a problem. And I think more and more Americans are going to come to that realization in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your insights here.
Ulrich,
and good
happy
job.
to be with you. Good luck with your conference.
Thanks.